Hey folks, this is Warren from the Paladin Journal, and welcome back to another book review on the channel where we talk about Warhammer, the Horus Heresy, and specifically this time, this is the 10th novel in the series. It's an anthology edited by Nick Campbell, Lindsay Priestley. It's called Tales of the Heresy, and it covers 7 different stories from a bunch of different, factions, not just Space Marines, and it talks about, what is going on in the wider galaxy at this point with, some of the different legions, the different factions, even the Emperor himself. It goes back and forth throughout the chronology, and it helps fill in some of the gaps that, gaps that we know of from other books outside of the series, and also gaps that, we've had so far in the series, which is like, okay, so these are characters we met at this point. Okay, what are they doing now after those, spectacular events? And that is where, this anthology, it really does its work. And, I am a huge fan of this book. Yeah, it's pretty much a classic at this point for me, and, something that I really wanted to get back to during this reread of the whole thing. And I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised, with a lot of different things. Some of the stories that I thought, they weren't as good, I understand them a little bit better now. And a lot of the different things, they make more sense as well. However, it also reminds me that, some things just get left by the wayside because there's some great callbacks, and then, nothing really happens with that because, priorities change, stories change, authors change, and some of these plot threads, they just go unresolved, as far as I know at least. I've read up to like maybe book 35 or 36, something like that, and I don't recall off the top of my head if some of the stories that I'll talk about, they get continued or not. But anyways, off the jump, we're just going to start with the first story here, so just check that out. Cheers. Alright, so welcome back to After the Jump, and here's the thing, right? The first short story in here, it's called Blood Games by Dan Abnett. This one focuses on the Adeptus Custodes, and as far as I can tell, this is like the first time we ever get an actual story from their perspective, because they have always been these mysterious, people within the lore. We don't really know much about them except that, they're pretty much the attendants to the Emperor. There's personal bodyguards. They are the executors of his will, at pretty much, at gunpoint. In the Heresy, it's just them. Whereas, in 40K, we know that the Inquisitors, they claim to speak with his will and with his knowledge and, with his authority. So this is a little very much different. And I think this was a really good story, but it did feel at times that, we're just spinning the wheels. The concept of the story is really interesting, that, the Custodes, that, during their lifetime, one of their many tasks is to find out any kind of, weak points within the Imperial defense systems on Terra. I don't know if, that applies to elsewhere within the Imperium, but for sure, at least where things on Terra are concerned, this is their remit. They are going to just, go dark as, singular agents, and then they're going to try and infiltrate the Imperial Palace in the Himalayan mountains, and they are just going to try and assassinate the Emperor, which is like, mind-blowing concept, but it's really good. And I think Dan found a really good hook with the story here, and he executes it really well. We meet our main character here, and we follow him on his journey as he, progresses throughout, the different steps of his infiltration. And it's just like, it's one of the boldest stories for sure that they have done. And it's just like, wow, they could not have just, it could not have been told any better, I feel, except for the fact that, like I said earlier, at times it feels like the story is spinning the wheels because there's a little bit too much description. The action has really wound down in that section of the story, and we're just waiting for things to happen as they do. And there's really good couple of hooks towards the climax, which I thought was really well done. And overall, the beat of the story is really good. But Amon Toramakian, he is probably, one of the coolest characters that we've seen in the series so far. Aside from the fact that he's a Custodes, because, he's also somebody who he's seemingly willing, he's willing to see past the surface of things. He just doesn't take anything at, face value. He wants to dig deeper. And of course, he's committed to the Emperor, to the other Custodes, and, it's just a really good, slice of life, essentially, as things are beginning to ramp up on Terra. News has already come in of the War Master's treachery. Dorn is busy fortifying everything. So what are the Custodes doing? This is the kind of stuff they're doing. They are, in effect, you could say that they are I wouldn't say they are the FBI of the Imperium, or at least where things on Terra are concerned. They're more like a very, very elite, investigative task force as well, which is, it's a really interesting hook. Because, like, if the story is just about, them just guarding the palace on Terra, guarding the Emperor, it's like, yeah, that's not really interesting, but they are actually agents of the Emperor. They are one of the few beings in the galaxy who can go anywhere unquestioned. And, there's a lot of stuff in here, which I really enjoyed. So, yeah, I would definitely rate this story in particular very highly. It's a great way to kick off the anthology. And, then it leads into Wolf at the Door by Mike Lee. Now, this is one of the stories I felt, with the benefit of hindsight. It's a really cool story, and it focuses on the 13th companies, the so-called 13th company that we know from the Space Wolves 40K series, which was started by William King in like 2000 or something. And, eventually it concluded with the author Lee Leitner, who I believe is, the pen name for a couple of different writers, one of them being Mike Lee here. And, they were the ones who essentially finished off the series after William King left. And, they introduced the concept of Bulve, Lord Bulve of the Space Wolves. He leads the Wolfen, essentially. So this is like a really good callback to that story. But, what really frustrated me was that this is our first look at the Space Wolves in the Heresy series. Not counting the character that we had in, the Battle for the Abyss, which was a character that was very one-dimensional. And, it's like, yeah, love-hate relationship there. So this is like the first proper look that we have of the Space Wolves, because in that novel, that guy, he was just like, he was an ancillary character, We don't really learn much about the Space Wolves other than whatever's on the surface. Whereas with this one, we really understand what Lord Bulve is about, what his people are about, how they approach war, how they approach, being Space Wolves, how they approach the Great Crusade, and, that's really it. So this is a Great Crusade story. This one's not a Heresy story. Now, what I feel personally is that, this was really good to see that, oh yeah, the enemy are probably like Dark Eldar here, and that was so cool because they really don't do much in the Heresy series overall. This is one of the very, very few examples of them doing anything, and it's always cool to see Dark Eldar just show up as the villains in any novel or any short story or whatever, because they are one of the most fascinating races within the world of Warhammer 40k. So they make for really good antagonists here, and more for the fact that also we don't really get anything from their point of view. Everything's from you see everything from the point of view of the Space Wolves, and this is a really good story about some of the atrocities that are committed by this nascent Imperium. While it is trying to unite all the different branches of humanity across the galaxy, some of them they don't want to join at all. They want to maintain their own independence. So what happens in that kind of environment, and the alliances that can be struck, and the betrayals that happen, and everything. And this is like one of those classic tragic stories of Warhammer 40k. Just this is the Heresy setting. All that said, really good characters from start to finish. But what I really and this is Nothing because of Mike Lee here specifically, but something that we'll get to, the novel Prosper Burns by Dan Abnett, because this is pretty much Bulwe's only appearance in the series. And with Prosper Burns, when it comes 6, 7, 8 books later, things are completely changed with the Space Wolves, and so there's that disconnect I have to fight while reading the story. And I much prefer this kind of a Space Wolf story than what we got with Prosper Burns. So it's a really cool story, but like I said, with the benefit of hindsight, it's really not, the threads really aren't continued later on. So this is like a one-off, and it kind of really sucks, because I would have loved to see more of these characters, and we just were give us the cool stuff. The part of the Heresy, is the fun with Heresy is seeing all these characters that we know from 40K, seeing them reflected. Most of them, pretty much all of them, are the Chaos characters, like Abaddon, or Lucius, or Ahriman, or what's his name, Typhus, and so many other characters that still survive to this day in 40K, and seeing how they work within the Heresy era or the Great Crusade era. So slightly missed opportunity here, but I really like that they didn't focus on the Russ at all. This was just a story about Bulwe and how he functions as a character. Really neat stuff. Now, the third story here, Scions of the Storm by Anthony Reynolds. This is probably one of my favorite stories in the book, and which is a surprising thing for me to say, because this is a story about the Ward Bearers. This is very soon after the Legion has been rebuked by the Emperor and punished by the Ultramarines for their slow pace during the Great Crusade, and one of their cities are burned on one of their special planets, and the Legion completely changes. We'll get to that with the novel The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, but this is one of the first entries we have in that entire era, and because we've only seen the Ward Bearers as again, ancillary characters with Erebus, in the first few books, or stuff like that. Plus, this one connects to Anthony's 40K series with the Ward Bearers, so there's some great callbacks to those characters. Really good stuff. Once again, what I said about Wolf at the Door by Mike Lee, that also applies here. Really cool story here, and this is pretty much my understanding with the story is that this is essentially the first instance of what happens when the Ward Bearers return to the Great Crusade in force, and now they're just going to conquer world after world after world, and they're not going to stop. They've given up their previous beliefs, so to speak, but seeing the events happen from the perspective of the characters that we have here, it's really amazing story. Great what would we say? Really great pace, really great characters, really great atmosphere, and definitely one of my favorite stories in the entire anthology. And I'll just say it right now, there is no story here that I feel is bad. Some are really good, some are good, and some are quite good. But overall, this is a very solid anthology. And with the mix of stories that we've seen so far, almost halfway through, it's amazing job by the editors to get all these different authors and tell all these stories. The number 4, The Voice by James Swallow. Now this one is a continuation of The Flight of the Eisenstein by James Swallow, and it focuses on some of the ancillary characters from that novel, which is the Silent Sisterhood, the Sisters of Silence. And we have Oblivion Knight Amandera Kendall, and she's sent on a mission after the events at the Solamna Citadel on Luna, and this is a dark story. This is this is where Warhammer goes into the horror aspects of the setting. In terms of how evocative the story is, top-notch points to Jim. He's been one of my favorite authors for a long time. I started off with his Blood Angels novels, continued on with his Sisters of Battle novels, and he does some really good work. Flight of the Eisenstein was fantastic. This story is also fantastic. The ending I personally didn't like, But that's because a character that I became quite fascinated by, the character was killed off, and I was like, that just made me sad, But this story also promises so much more. This is the first time we really get a look into the first person perspectives of the Sisters of Silence, something which is, I'm not sure if it happens again in the series, but in 40K there are some novels that focus on this faction with the characters of this faction, and those are fantastic stories as well. So this is like covering a lot of ground that you really wouldn't expect. Really good mystery here. It's a horror mystery, and he describes everything so well. And there's like part of the ending is like it's a little bit defeatist. It's grim dark. There's so much horror going on. There are sort of betrayals happening and whatnot. And I was like, again, really bold choice for a story, right? And that's why I think this anthology really hits it out of the park, because a lot of the later anthologies, they are just mostly focused on the Astartes themselves, whereas here the first one is Custodes, the fourth one is Sisters of Battle, and it's like, where else are we gonna go? So once again, solid story here. The fifth one of my favorite authors, once again, Gaff Thorpe, Call of the Lion. This one is, it falls in the quite good category of stories in this anthology. It covers the character Chapter Master Astalan, who we know from, Angels of Darkness, one of the most classic and iconic novels of 40K. We know that he's a traitor to the Dark Angels Legion. He did something, and it's like we learn about him in that story, and now here we see him as a loyalist. And this is like after the experience with the Descent of Angels, that novel was just like, I hate to say it, but like that novel was so bad, just overall. And this one, it kind of like it heals some of those wounds by introducing a familiar character, but it also kind of carries the fact that the Heresy team didn't really figure out what to do with the Lion. The Lion himself isn't in the story. It's mostly focused on Astalan and his one of the other chapter masters of the Legion, Belath, where Astalan is a Terran-born Astartes, whereas Belath is he's from Caliban itself. After the Lion was found there, and the Legion was renamed the Dark Angels. So there's a culture clash that I found really fascinating to read about and everything, because these two guys, one is an experienced commander, the other guy is fresh, essentially fresh. He's just like few years in to the Great Crusade. They clashed constantly over how to prosecute a war, and I was like, that is really interesting. We don't see that kind of dissension within the legions often, at least during the Great Crusade era. We see some of that during the Flight of the Eisenstein with the Luna Wolves and everything, even a little bit with Fulgrim and whatnot. But it's like, that is more like, actual personalities clashing with people who were experienced. Whereas this one is more like, an experienced, like 100-year-old commander or something, and another guy who's like, he's essentially a fresh rookie. Good stuff. But also, this ending is a little bit ominous, and like I said, it leans into the the concepts of the Lion being an untrustworthy commander. He doesn't really trust the people under him, especially those who are Terran, let alone the ones from Caliban. He really doesn't trust the Terran ones, and that wasn't conveyed very well here, and that definitely brings down, I feel, the impact of the story for me. But still, fascinating read. It's very much like The Wolf at the Door, with a character we know from 40K. He's brought back by an author who has written him before, and so on and so forth. The sixth story in here, it's The Last Church by Graham McNeil. And this might be one of the most impactful stories in all of 40K, or in Warhammer, because this is the first time we get a story that is somewhat from the perspective of the emperor himself. The essence of the story is that, the unification war on Terra, it's about to come to a close. The emperor has succeeded in uniting mankind and, driving away the darkness of religion from the planet. And there's just this one last church left somewhere in the Mediterranean. And the emperor has arrived there, and we see him through the eyes of the priest who looks after the church, who delivers sermons there. He's like 70 years old or 80 years old or whatever at this point. And he is like, he's near the end of his life. He's seen so much, and a lot of the story is from his point of view, with the secondary point of view of the emperor, as the priest hears him talking. And I was like, once again, I was just struck, what a fascinating hook. The emperor is trying to convince this priest, essentially the last priest on Terra, that he should give up his religion and join in the unification, and join in the spoils of this coming war that the emperor is going to unleash on the galaxy, and just join humanity as everybody celebrates. And it's like just the vision to tell that story, to have the idea of, okay, this is what we want to do, and then carrying through with it. And I think personally doing a very good job. I've heard over the years a lot that the arguments that the emperor makes are kind of like facetious, or it's really bad argumentative logic and everything. But it's like, I don't have that sophisticated a brain. I'm reading the story, I'm taking a lot of stuff on the face value of it, and I'm just getting lost in the story. Whether or not the emperor's arguments are good, it's a fascinating insight into the character, and that is what I really admire about him. And of course, you just really feel sorry for this priest, because from the get-go, what's going to happen, how the story is going to progress. The church is coming down, but as we delve further and further into the pages, it's like we learn about the history of that church itself, of the religion, and just the priest himself, from his misguided youth and his time as a warrior, fighting on some of the the worst battles of Terra in that timeline, to him becoming a priest and dealing with his flock and whatever. It's like really good stuff. Amazing, great pacing, great characters, and a resolution that will surprise you. Despite everything, it surprised me upon the reread, because I remember some things, not others, and then it's just like, so I still had that the sense of wonder and everything. Now the final the final story is called After Desh'ea, or Desh'ea, or however that is pronounced, and it is written by Aaron Dembski-Bowden. This is one of the shortest stories in the entire anthology, and also, once again, what a hook. We start off, from the perspective of Karn, who's the 8th company captain of the World Leaders Legion. At this point in time, they're called the Warhounds. They are a very berserk kind of legion, very physical, very aggressive, and they have just found their Primarch. He's been delivered to them. He's a complete mess. He's ranting. He's already killed so many other senior captains and leaders of the Legion, and it's Karn's turn next to go and try to placate him. And there are others with him, other senior commanders who are like, let me go, or Karn, don't do this, you're just gonna die, whatever. But that just provides an insight into what kind of a character Karn used to be. He was honorable, he believed in some things, and then events happen and he changes. So this is a great look at Karn, but more than that, it's a fascinating insight into Angron himself, Angry Ron. And it's like, not really expecting that, because at this point, Angron is a mess. He's just been taken from the planet that he grew up on. He was a slave. He fought in the gladiator pits. He had some friends with him. They were all left to die by the Emperor. And, it just continues to highlight that the Emperor was an imperfect being. Which is like, you take those strands of thought from the last church, you see another viewpoint on that. And, you see that, okay, so the Emperor, he kept too many secrets. He didn't really consider the feelings of his sons when he made certain decisions. He didn't consider the impacts of those decisions, of his actions, and why, all of that just combined to form this explosive atmosphere where, half the sons rebel, and destroy the dreams of a united mankind that could dominate the galaxy in its entirety, where, humanity is the preeminent species and everybody else is pretty much being destroyed, genocided. So, yeah, it's short, but it's, like I said, great insight into both of these characters, Karn himself and Angron, because, Angron is just like, what am I doing here? What is my purpose? Where are my friends? And, he's struggling with his trauma and with his distress. Not just because of the events that he's witnessed, just prior to coming to the Conqueror, the flagship of the Legion, but also, his childhood years. Like I said, he was a slave, he was a gladiator, he was forced to fight, and now he is just drifting. And how these two characters, how they connect with each other, how they help each other, learn more about themselves as characters, and seeing how that's going to progress. And, once again, you feel certain pity for some of these characters. You see what kind of a man Karn used to be, what he becomes. You see what kind of a man Angron used to be, what he becomes. And just like I said, this was like the first few years of the Heresy. It's a lot of experimentation, right? After the first 4 books, they just branch out in so many different directions, so many different viewpoints, whether it's the Astartes or Mortals or Custodes or Sisters of Silence or whatever. So much to discover here, and I feel that this is a great capstone to those first 10 books. Some of the stories could have been a little bit better for sure, but I think this was a great point to bookend like this first wave of stories, I would say, because things start changing very soon. Now after this book with book 11, I'm not sure which one comes after this, but I do remember that things start to gain steam, because now they've set up so many different story points, so many characters, and after this, especially after this one, we need to follow through up with a lot of that stuff and how that develops and everything. So yeah, really great anthology. Loved it. Fantastic reread experience, even though it took me like a month and a half to read this, mostly because I was just busy with other things and whatnot. But yeah, excellent stories, great anthology in its entirety, and just like definitely one of my favorite books. So yes, I highly recommend this. Don't skip it, seriously. I know there's this inclination for some people to speed read a series, so they're just like, okay, what is the absolute minimum I have to read? But it's like the fun is in reading everything, experiencing everything. It's like the whole thing, that with streaming now you get seasons for shows that are 6 episodes, 8 episodes, 10 episodes, whereas a lot of people who have grown up for years or decades, even like 22 to 26 episode seasons for a show. You like all those different experiences that come with little by little bit characters get developed, and there are so many different stories going on, so much experimentation happens, whereas with streaming a lot of stuff is just like condensed, it's really tight, or supposed to be. So yeah, definitely read this one. Not gonna be disappointed. That's just what I feel. I had a lot of fun, and I hope that if you get to this series yourself, you have a lot of fun with this book as well. So, and if you do, just let me know. But in the meantime, yeah, that's it for me. and we'll see you with the next book review very soon. Cheers. Bye.